was quite thin, but it was quite heavy as well.
Toxic.
Imagine, but the toxicity in this case is great.
I'm just saying this because lead was starting to be used very early on, and we didn't know how toxic it was.
You fill it up with ballast and you lift it. Hello everyone and welcome to Underwater Adventures with Alex Mirabal. Today we will talk about how to identify a shipwreck that you have found, how to identify it to the best of your knowledge. I will guide you through a small process and analyze the elements that are good for that. So let's dive into it. I'm making this video because I have seen in the comments of YouTube and also for messages that you guys have sent me that there is an interest from you guys, from the audience, the ones that see the videos, in how can we identify that this ship is from this age or is coming from this country. So I wanted to put together a list of things you can do to help you on that. I have made a previous video which is called How to Date a Shipwreck, in which I touch some of these aspects. Now I will try to do it a little bit more in depth because it will not only be about the age of the ship but also other information that you can gather from the artifacts or from the scenes of the ship that you will find in the seabed. This will apply to all shipwrecks, to shipwrecks of historical value, let's say 16, 17, 18, 19 centuries. We are talking about these shipwrecks, wooden ships. The more modern steel ships are a different thing. We can just look for the serial number and find out which ship it is. Unfortunately not with the wooden ships from those centuries way back. So we will have to handle some elements that you normally find in the ships that will help us with that. First, when you find a shipwreck and you already identify that is a shipwreck, meaning that you are finding enough elements in the seabed, enough objects that will suggest that you have found a shipwreck, meaning that you will have ballast, you will have cannon, anchors, you will have some of these elements that you can safely assume that yes, there is a shipwreck. I believe that almost the first thing that comes to mind for every researcher would be how old it is. And this is a question that will be not that difficult to answer if you look into the right places. For instance, every ship, every wooden ship of that time would have ballast. Why? Because these ships were too high, they were too tall, let's say. They will float a lot, they will be very high in the water, meaning that the ship would tilt too much and it will eventually flip.
So too high of a buoyance point, I assume, for the ship.
Yeah, well, the right term would be the gravity center would be too high in comparison to the surface of the sea.
There you go. Yeah.
Meaning that the ship will tilt a lot. There is a very interesting video in internet, I saw it many years ago, of a reproduction of a galleon, let's say, that was made in Portugal, and they made it with the constructive techniques of the time, so it was a great job. They did a beautiful ship, and they forgot to put the ballast on, and when they put the ship in the Tejo River, it just flipped. It didn't last 5 minutes. It was almost immediate. The ship went into the water and just capsized.
That's so funny that they missed that one very crucial point to be able to test. How could they be so technically correct and not know that the gravitational pull would be higher in such a tall... Enfin, doesn't matter.
I mean...
Yeah.
And obviously they know better.
At least they should, yeah.
But something happened. Something happened. Someone forgot. One didn't brought the key of the storehouse where the ballast was. So something happened. So yes, every ship was ballast. They put ballast into the ship to lower down the gravity center and make the ship more stable and capable of navigating from going from A to B in a safe way. So many things were used as ballast. Many times you will find different kind of ballast, and this could help you a bit. For instance, Iberian ships, that the Spanish and the Portuguese ships, which let's say during the age of the discoveries are the ships which were more abundant. The possibilities in the Caribbean and in Africa and in Indian Ocean of finding a shipwreck of the Portuguese or the Spanish is quite high in comparison to other nations. And Portuguese and Spanish, they use a lot round stones as ballast, what we call ballast stones, because they are river stones, they are very heavy, they are very dense, and they are easily recognizable in coral seas. When you are in a sea which is mainly made of coral and not of volcanic rocks, you will spot a mound of river stones in the seabed very easily. This is one of the most common finds when you are working either in the Caribbean or in the Indian Ocean, that you could see these stones stick out of the seabed. They are different of the rest of the seabed that you can identify. Okay, in principle and as in general, the round stones are older than rectangular stones or brick-like. They were used afterwards because imagine, round stones are, yes, very heavy, but there is a lot of space between the stones. You put one stone on top of the other and you have a lot of empty spaces. And in a ship, it is very important to maximize the capacity of the ship to transport stuff. So they got a little bit more efficient and they started giving shape to the rocks, to the stones, so they can fit better and reduce this lost space. So in principle and as a general term, round stones will be older than square or rectangular stones as ballast.
I think that that's also the reason why the pizza box is a square and not round. Honestly, I think due to production,
course,
that's the reason, because it's better
you
to
can
stack.
store them, to stack them, to pack them properly, to maximize your space. Same happened with the ships. And then later on it came iron blocks or iron bars as ballast. This is a very rough estimate for you to realize more or less the age of your ship. Round ballast stones would be older. The square ballast stones or the rectangular ones would be after those, so a little bit more modern than the round ones. And then it will come the iron blocks or iron bars. That is a general appreciation that you will have just by looking at the wreck site when you arrive. A second thing that you could see also quite early in your investigation of the wreck is which kind of hull sheathing it has. The ships being made of wood, they were attacked by the teredo worm, and the sailors, the navigators, they found out very quickly that this was dangerous because the teredo worm is a worm that eats wood and it lives in the sea and it will get into your ship, into the hull of your ship, and it will just eat it. And you can end up, after a couple of years using a ship and you don't know how much damage the teredo worm has done to your ships, you can sink. There is not only one case, there are plenty of cases that ships that sunk because they were just eaten. The worm just ate your ship. So they obviously wanted to avoid that, and they started covering the hull of the ships with the thin layer of something. The first thing that they used was lead. What we call lead sheeting around the ship. This lead layer, it was quite thin, but it was quite heavy as well. Imagine, but the toxicity in this case.
I'm just saying this because lead was starting to be used very early on, and we didn't know how toxic it was, and I assume that people that are on a ship for many, many days in a row exposed to maybe that amount of lead, or maybe it wasn't that much. So the toxicity was useful for the worms, 100%, but for the humans, I don't know.
I don't believe any of them stopped at any moment to figure
to
that
wonder.
out. Yeah, to wonder if that would be good or not for them.
If they weren't dying of scabies or some dying thing in the ship, I think that they were happy.
Exactly. that was the function of the lead sheathing, having a way to avoid the marine organisms that could harm your ship, that could damage the wood of your ship. And at the same time, obviously, if there was any leak or anything between the planks, the lead is also very easy to use because it's so soft. It's very easy to use to close this waterway, let's call it this way, of this leaking. So if you find a wreck site, you already have your ballast, type of ballast you have, and then if you explore a little bit around, you will certainly find remains of this sheeting, of this cover of the hull. If you find that it's made of lead, yeah, that will put you again a little bit earlier than the copper sheeting, which came right afterwards, because they obviously also realized that lead is heavy, and being heavy, it makes your ship slower. And everything in commerce is about time, and you cannot just, if you can make a trip in 3 months, you don't want to make it in 3.5 months because you are using the wrong sheeting. So they started producing and covering the ships with copper, which is lighter and is as good as lead in preventing the marine organisms, because the oxide of the copper is also very poisonous. The marine organisms will not attach to it. So as a general term, ships started being copper sheeted from 1779 onwards. That means that if you find lead sheeting in a wreck, it will be most probably before 1779. And then you will have copper sheeting in a wreck, and you know that it must be after 1779, because that was the moment in which orders were given to replace all lead sheeting from the ships and replace them by copper sheeting. I'm talking mainly about the English ships, but because they were the first one. But then Portugal and Spain, they also realized that it was a good technological advance, and they assume it as well a little bit later than the English. But you already have two things. You have a type of ballast that you have found, plus which kind of coverage of the hull it had.
Sorry, I'm thinking the entire time if I will have to bleep this terminology because of YouTube. I really hope that they understand that it's the cover of the hull and not anything else.
That's on you, my dear. You will have to figure that out.
It's okay.
Hopefully it's okay. Well, a third point that you can also check quite quickly in your research is which kind of joinery the ship had. Which kind of pins, nails, bolts, how did they put together the wooden planks? If it was with iron nails or with copper nails, for instance, or a wooden spike. There are plenty of this joinery. And again, as a matter of ballpark figure, you would have the iron nails and the iron bolt to be older than the copper one, because it happens something quite interesting. When sheeting of the hull of the ship was changed from lead to copper, they kept on using the iron nails, and obviously it creates a chemical reaction which damaged the copper cover of the ship very quickly, so it need to be replaced very fast. So after 1779, it took them, when the copper sheeting started being used, it took them till 1786 for them to realize that nope, we need to use copper nail instead of iron nail, so we reduce this galvanic process that will destroy the sheeting of the hull.
It took them almost 10 years. I'm very glad that we're being a little bit more proactive and a bit faster at noticing things.
Well, in historical terms, it's quite fast.
Totally, of course.
We can say that they reacted quickly. I mean, the damage in the copper sheeting of the ships was quite heavy as well. It was quite fast that they realized, oh, something is going wrong here. You can have, again, another little element that can tell you, okay, it has a copper joinery. Well, then it should be after 1786. This is something that you will guess, because then again, none of this estimation in one of the objects. After talking about 3 of them, you cannot take just one of them to create a good estimation. Everything that I will talk in this video, you must understand it as part of a group of actions that will give you a context. In this context of the answers that you are getting from this investigation, you will be closer to the truth. If you take only one, it will be too risky for not being true, for not being correct. Okay, then let's talk about something. Okay, obviously, artifacts with the date on it. That is something that every researcher of a shipwreck would love, because you will have an artifact. There are quite some artifacts with inscribed dates, including sometimes even the cannons. Iron cannons, as I mentioned in another episode, are a little bit more difficult to find the marks on them, but bronze cannons have plenty of marks. Those marks could include the year in which they were made, but could include also the name of the founder or the house of the foundry, meaning that it could put you in some place already and in some time. Because if you know that Antonio Gomez worked between 1580 and 1622, then you can assume that this cannon, which have the A and the G of Antonio Gomez, it will have been produced in that time bracket. But there are artifacts which have inscribed dates and will give you something that the archaeologists we call terminus post quem. Sorry for the Latin, but it's a term that we use. It will indicate the moment in which the ship couldn't have sunk before that. So the ship, and I'm talking only about shipwrecks now. This applies for archaeology in other fields as well, but I'm talking about shipwrecks. That's what I reduce it to, shipwrecks and when it sunk. Typical example, you have a coin which is dated 1622. The ship cannot have sunk before 1622 because that coin wouldn't have been made yet. This applies for every artifact with a date. An astrolabe with a date 1645, it will indicate that the astrolabe was built, it was made before the ship sank, obviously, so the ship sank after 1645. That is the terminus post quem. There is another term, which is the terminus ante quem, but that is much more difficult to apply. That will indicate the moment in which the ship shouldn't have sunk later than that. So it is a date in which the ship should have sunk before that date. That's very difficult to identify and to understand because ships, they could have traveled with old stuff. I mean, if my expedition ship sinks, I'm really sorry for the archaeologists in 2 or 3 centuries because we will have a GPS together with an astrolabe and a coin, yeah, and an iPhone and the coin dated in 1558. So it will be a headache for the archaeologists. But yes, the ships transported things of various dates. So it is very difficult to tell the terminus ante quem. But for instance, you could find, as we did in the Inés de Soto wreck, you could find a large amount of silver in form of discs or ingots, you know, a cargo of silver. Then when you analyze the silver, you realize that has no trace of mercury. Mercury started being used in the refine of the silver in 1554. So having not only one object, but a large amount of objects made of silver and not finding any trace of mercury,
for a fact,
that at least that cargo was produced before 1554. Because in 1554 and 1555 or 1556, this kind of technology spread quickly in all the mint houses and they start refining the silver with mercury. That also goes for instance, in a ship, if you find a large amount of mercury, which happens quite often, if you find this large amount of mercury, the only reason for them to have such an amount of mercury is because it's after 1554, because already the mercury was used in the refining of the silver. So these are hints, this is information, this is data you are collecting during your research that when you put them all together, you could have a very good idea of more or less how old your ship is. There are other elements as well, because you know that there are some type of objects like bottles or sort of navigational instruments and various artifacts that they were produced in a certain time. In the glass bottle, the added lip is started being used used in this year and stop being used in the other year. So all these elements will you can make a graphic on, like I do, make a graphic of all the years that the objects that you're finding in the shipwreck are produced, and then you can start shrinking more or less which could have been when the ship went down and transformed itself into a wreck. These elements that I'm talking, they are called Chrono-Diagnostic artifacts, or artifacts with Chrono-Diagnostic attributes, because they will help you. There are some better than others. For instance, you will find anchors in a shipwreck. Anchors are tricky because anchors were made, or they have been made, more or less in the same shape for centuries. So it will be very difficult to tell apart if this anchor is older or newer than this other one. There's still some few things to take into consideration. For instance, the anchors that in the arms are in a straight angle, so they are in this shape, we call it arrow anchors or straight pattern. The straight pattern anchors will be in Iberian ships, it will be much older than the curved arms anchor, or what we call as Admiralty pattern anchors. That would be a first view, but watch out, it's tricky, because then when I talk about the provenance of the ship, from where it's coming from, we will see that between different countries, these, for instance, these anchors were used in different times. So now talking about Iberian ships, yes, in principle, anchors with straight arms will be older than anchors with curved arms. The shaft of the anchor, the long part of the anchor, the stem, it would have either cylindrical sections or it would be square section. In principle, cylindrical sections is older than the square section, which is a little bit newer, even between the same kind of arms that the anchors would have. Then the last part on the anchor is the stock. The stock is this element that the anchor has in the back that will help the anchor not to tilt. Well, they were wooden stock or iron stock. Iron stock in anchors, this movable iron stock that everyone knows that is like this, and you find in many anchors, in all drawings and in all photos, you will see mostly that kind of stock. That stock started being used in 1850, after 1850, so it's much modern. You will find an anchor that you will see no stock, it means that it had a wooden stock and now it's gone. So that is another element that will give you also a range of years. Wooden stock would be anchors before 1850, and iron stock would be anchors after 1850. So there are a few elements. Now when I talk about the provenance of the ships, you will see that this is tricky. That's why you must consider all these elements together and not guide your investigation just by one of them, because it could be deceiving. You could be assuming or thinking that you understood something which is not correct. A second step would be to try to figure out the provenance of the ship, where it came from. Either the flag, or if the ship was Portuguese, if it was Spanish, if it was English, or where it was coming from. Judging by the artifacts is a little bit risky, because ships in their nature, they were transporting goods, and they could have brought goods from different countries, so normally they have a variety of objects on board from different provenance. It is hard to tell only based on the
Only
artifact.
based on the cargo, you can't really tell where something is coming from. There are, as you mentioned, merchant vehicles. That's the whole point.
It gives you anyway some hints.
Of
I mean,
course.
if you see a ship that is an Iberian ship that is coming with a cargo of Chinese porcelain, you could assume that it's coming from the east. But then again, it could have been coming from Mexico, and this porcelain been transported in the Manila galleon and arrived from Acapulco. So it will not be like written in stone. You have to take this as a part of your research data, but it will not be like the one that will give you the truth. Same happened with the cannons. Cannons were produced in many different countries in Europe, and they were traded. They were sold. Sweden sold cannons to every naval power in Europe. So it is very common that you will find a Spanish ship or a Portuguese ship or an English ship with Swedish cannons. Also, the Spaniards, they were building cannons in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal as well. So it is not quite straightforward that you say, okay, we found 10 cannons, 8 of them are Portuguese and 2 of them are Spanish, or one is Spanish and the other one is Italian. Well, okay, if you have such a big quantity of Portuguese cannons, you could assume that, well, it's more inclined to be Portuguese than from another nation. But sometimes you find this very difficult to realize. Now we talk about the anchors. I just talked about the anchors before because of the dating. But for instance, the straight pattern anchors, which I said that if Iberian ships will say that the ship is older than the curved arms anchor, well, in the case of the English ships, it doesn't work like that because they were using this straight pattern way into 1700s. I mean, I think it's like in 1770 some, they were still using this straight arms anchor when the Spaniards and the Portuguese were already long time ago have changed to the curved arms anchors. What that means, that if you don't put together all the elements, you could, by mistake, be analyzing or estimating the age of the anchor without knowing where it comes from, and you can be making a mistake. Because if you said, okay, an arrow anchor is cool, or for me it's easy, that is 16th century or first half of the 17th century. But if it's an English ship, it could be mid-18th century. So you have a century of difference that you can mistake just because not putting together if the ship was English or Spanish
just
or
by
Portuguese.
checking only one of the things that you need
Various
to
elements.
look at.
These are things that you have to consider altogether. For instance, the kind of ballast. Ships from the same age would have different type of ballast being from different nationalities. The English were the first ones to start carving the stones to make them fit better into the ship than the Portuguese and the Spaniards. For them it took a little bit longer. Maybe because the viability of the river stones in America was so great that they didn't want to go through the hardship of making shapes in the stones where they can use it like that. So for whatever reason, the ballast in form of bricks, and here there is also an interesting thing. When I say ballast in form of bricks, it's because they have the form of bricks, but they were not bricks. You know, square shape, they look like bricks, but they are bigger and they are made of other material. But there was a country which loved using as ballast bricks, real bricks, and that was the Netherlands. Why did they have so many bricks, or they were so good at making bricks that they use it as ballast? I haven't studied that, but I promise that I will, because normally when you find bricks in a shipwreck, any old shipwreck, they normally belong to the galley, because you have to cook in the ship and you don't want to make a fire in a wooden ship. So you will have bricks to make the galley and they cook in there. But when you find these kind of bricks, there are normally few of them. If you find a large amounts of bricks, you can most probably say that you are dealing with a Dutch wreck. This is one of the few times that the possibilities of the shipping of any other nation is very small.
Maybe Indonesians, if they were influenced by using brick as a ballast in a ship, or somebody that was in touch with the Dutch is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, maybe Indonesians use something similar. My experience with Indonesian ships is that I own one. I used to own one. No, and one time that is a wooden big ship, but really big one, the Al Mirage. It's already sunk, but at that time it was a very big ship made of wood. And one time we had a leaking, and we had to try to fix the leaking from inside. And I realized that the ship was full of ballast, but ballast stones, like a 16th century ship.
Yeah, so they got influenced since then.
They're using river ballast stones. I have some photos, I will show you the photos. Okay, so in this case, this atypical kind of ballast bricks, then you can most probably say that it's a Dutch ship. Okay, but then again, never trust one of these elements by itself. Go for the context. In archaeology, context is the most important thing. Very rarely you will have great reliable information based on one artifact or one issue. You have to really consider the context. Another quite a good thing to check once you are already excavating the wreck is that if if there is any remains of the wood structure of the hull, yes, the construction techniques between countries differ a bit, even in the same time. If you find, for instance, this mast step of a ship, I have an example because I have worked in Spanish ships and Portuguese ships with remains of hulls, and you will see the difference in construction in a Spanish ship in the mast step and in the Portuguese ship in the mast step of more or less the same year. I mean, there were few years of difference between the two wrecks, and the construction was quite different. You could identify that this one was Spanish and this one was Portuguese. So the naval architecture of these ships and how they were built, it will also give you quite reliable information of where the ship was, which country it was. Again, ships were sold, ships were traded. A merchant of Spain could have bought a Portuguese built ship. That happened. But okay, it will then again give you more data in the research that you are doing. So the provenance of the ship will also help you understanding the entire picture. Another step that you want to take when you are investigating a wreck is also, you already know how old, more or less, where it came from, but you want to know also the size of the ship, or estimate the size of the ship. All right, this one is not that difficult, because you could, if you are excavating the wreck, you could first weight the ballast. I know it will sound silly that I said let's weight the ballast, but
weigh the rocks a little bit, yeah.
But it's not so, because during the excavation of a shipwreck, you will need to remove the ballast. So the only thing you have to do is to remove the ballast in a controlled manner. For instance, you have a net, as we did, you fill it up with ballast, and you lift it with the 500 kilo lifting bag. A balloon that you fill with air that it will lift up to 500 kilos. So you fill it up, you try to pull it up to the surface to move this ballast to another place, and you start taking ballast out till it goes on with 500 kilos. So you know that approximately this amount of ballast that you took out was 500 kilos, meaning half a ton. And you can do that. You can count how many times you have removed ballast. In that way, you can add it up and you will have an approximate weight of the ballast that the ship was carrying. So that will help you calculating how big the ship should have been. Okay, you have to make a distinction. If the ship was coming with cargo, it would have much less ballast. But if the ship was going empty without cargo to America, for instance, from Spain to America to go and fetch cargo there, they will have much more ballast than they would have in their way back. But okay, these are things that you can help by other elements. You can imagine if the ship was outward bound or homeward bound. This is something that is part of your research as well. There are other ways of calculating the size of the ship, because for instance, you have already the weight of the ballast. You can see how many cannons it will have in the place. Remember, people could have come and take cannons out, so you may have less cannons than the ship had, but you at least have the minimum amount of cannons that she was carrying, because they are the ones that are there. So the weight of the cannons, the amount of cannons, the weight of the ballast, these will also start giving you a picture of the approximate size that the ship would have. Another way of doing it, there is a formula, which I will not use here, but there is a formula for calculating the tonnage of the ship, the displacement of the ship, based on some structural parts of the hull. If you are lucky enough to find that wood, but some pieces of structure that by the size of that piece, you could, through a formula, you could calculate with certain degree of accuracy the tonnage of that ship. So for you to know that there are various ways in which you can end up estimating the size of the ship. Why do you need all these? Because with all these elements that I have mentioned, you have three pieces of information which are very important in your research. If you don't know which shipwreck you found, what ship it was. It happens very often that you have to, like a detective, you want to go through the story and try to add up evidence to try to discover who was that ship. So I wanted to mention this to you.
I've been thinking this entire time when you've been explaining, and overall since we started the channel. I'm sure this happens with most things, but a big part of what I think it's so exciting about your job is exactly this, that you cannot isolate any of the parts to be able to make a big conclusion, and that you need a lot of things to make sense to be able to make as much of an educated guess as you can, whilst maybe other activities you can make certain assumptions without being 100% sure. With maritime archaeology and archaeology in general, I assume all of this is a bit trickier. It's easier for you to get confused. It's easier for you to misinterpret. And I think that that's what makes the activity equally as exciting but challenging.
You're right, but one of the reasons why this happened is first because archaeology is not the science. Although archaeologists love talking about themselves as a scientist, archaeology is not a science. We are guessing, we are estimating, and we are trying to use science to gather the data in the best way possible. I love saying that archaeology is just a research activity, because this is what we do. We research and we try to come up with the best answer possible with the data that you could get. Even in the way that you collect this data is important, because if you collected it wrong, it could lead you to wrong conclusions. So yes, in archaeology it's very seldom that you can responsibly say, I'm 100% sure of this, I'm 100% sure of that. Better don't do that, because it's very few times. For instance, you might have been thinking, if you are in the shipwreck world and you have been working on shipwrecks or interested about shipwrecks, and you have been reading or watching documentaries, you might have noticed that I didn't mention certain artifacts that will give you the right identity of the ship, because these ones are very seldom that you come across. Everyone may be thinking in the bell of the ship that have the name of the ship and the year. Yes, that has happened very seldom. And if it happens to your wreck, you can consider yourself very lucky. But this is not the normal thing.
Can it be assumed that maybe those artifacts are the first ones to try to be retrieved, even back then when the sinking or the battle happens?
Well, some of them, yes. I mean, there are very few artifacts that will be made for a certain ship. It has to be a very prominent ship that it will deserve a bell with its name or an astrolabe with its name. This is not that common. That's why I didn't want to use this sort of list of things that you have to do. I didn't want to start it or to use any exception, because as an exception now it would be very easy. Everything that Alex said, you can forget it if you find the bell with the name of the ship. But I haven't found any, and I have investigated many ships, and I haven't found once a bell that will tell me, hey Alex, you are in this ship. Nope. And you will not find the plank of the ship on the side with the name of the ship. That will not happen. That will not happen. And I know many people ask me, I mean, people who are not in this, they don't need to know these details. And they ask me, how do you know that you're working in the San Jose or in the Nossa Senhora de Consolação? How do you find out? And I have to explain them all this in a way that, okay, with all this, we can safely assume that it should be. That it should be.
We can safely start assuming that potentially this could be.
It will be.
But that's how it is.
It will be an educated guess. That is how I call it. Thank you very much for getting this far into the video, for watching till the end. If you have any other doubt that you think I could answer regarding the investigation of shipwrecks, please let me know in the comments. You see, for one comment that a friend asked me, I put together this video because I realized that it would be interesting for people to know certain details. So if you have that sort of question, please let me know. I will be, as usual, checking, and it may generate a new idea for a new video. So leave me a like if you like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe if you haven't done it yet, and let's keep on diving.